perfect, but it is a necessary response to an unprecedented crisis. With these policies, coupled with the efforts of the private sector and the American people, we will defeat the virus and be ready for what will truly be a great American comeback.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield to the chair of the Financial Services Committee and a senior member of the Congress of the United States, Maxine Waters from the state of California.
How much time?
4 minutes.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 748, now referred to as the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. Congress must take action to provide relief and assistance to the millions of people across the nation who are struggling in the midst of this national public health and economic emergency. With 3.3 million Americans filing for unemployment last week, 1 million Californians filing for unemployment in the last 2 weeks, and many families struggling to make ends meet, it is our duty as elected officials to step up and help them. Several weeks ago, as the chair of the Financial Services Committee, I led the Democratic members on the Financial Services Committee in devising a comprehensive plan to address the financial services aspects of the coronavirus crisis. I am pleased that today's bill includes some elements of this plan. The legislation before us takes important steps to protect and provide relief for consumers, renters, homeowners, and people experiencing homelessness. The bill would address the shortage of key medical supplies and equipment by providing $1 billion appropriation to the Defense Authorization Act Fund. It would support small businesses and local territory and state governments and ensure that any federal aid to corporations has conditions and independent oversight. The bill provides $4 billion to help combat the outbreak of this disease among the homeless community. Most importantly, building upon my proposal, most individuals and families across the country will receive a check or direct deposit for $1,200 for each adult and $500 for each child to help our families who are struggling during this unprecedented crisis. While I'm pleased that the legislation includes these provisions that Democrats fought for, while I support the bill's passage, I must make it clear that the legislation is far from comprehensive and that there are issues that it leaves unaddressed and areas where it falls short. H.R. 748 does not prohibit negative credit reporting during the crisis, forgive student loan debt, suspend all consumer credit payments, among other concerns. However, despite these shortcomings, this bill is the most consequential piece of legislation that many of us will ever vote on. The American people need help, and they need it now. And this bill represents a down payment on that relief. I look forward to working with the Speaker, my committee colleagues, the Senate, and others on the next phase of relief. While it is clear that Congress must pass a fourth package to address these and other shortcomings, the passage of today's bill is critical for all families and communities. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the top Republican on the Budget Committee, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a responsibility to the people we serve, and the moment is now to mitigate the damage to our people and our economy. For those who question the price tag, for those who question certain features in the bill, think of the images we've all seen that are unprecedented in our lifetimes. The senior citizen, only able to see family members through a window. Worse yet, Americans dying alone. The frontline medical professional fighting an invisible disease, risking their very lives to bring hope to a frightened public. The businessman fighting to stay solvent, to keep a workforce, and to live to see another day. The scientists and engineers desperately searching for an answer. Who among us can question the crisis we're in and the needs of the people we serve. By midday today, Mr. Speaker, let us be remembered for taking the action necessary to put aside our politics.
Gentleman's time's
and
expired.
deliver
Gentleman
for the
from
American
Texas
people. I yield back.
reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who also has seen challenge upfront and personal. And I yield to her 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be voting for this bill for the children who are foregoing their school and for the millions of children for whom that means that they are losing the stability and the nutritional support that comes with it. I will be voting for this bill for my family members and my friends and constituents who have lost their jobs in the past 2 weeks because of this pandemic. I will be voting for this bill so that we may deliver support to the small business owners and restaurateurs throughout Central Virginia who have closed their doors in order to stop this pandemic and keep their neighbors safe. And I will be voting for this bill for the healthcare workers in my district who are risking their lives to make our community safer. And I am grateful to the sanitation worker, the mail carriers, the UPS workers, the FedEx workers, the grocery store workers, those who work in our nursing homes and facilities across our district and across our country. I thank them for adding a bit of stability to our country during this incredibly difficult time.
Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining?
The gentleman has 53½ minutes. And the gentleman from Maryland has 39 minutes. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to my fellow Texan, Mr. Flores.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, a few days ago, White House and congressional Republicans presented a bold bipartisan plan of action to help hardworking Americans deal with our current challenges. This plan puts much-needed resources where they're most needed: our families, our health care system, our small businesses, other businesses affected by this crisis, and our state and local governments. One of the things that we found out during this crisis is that our health care system supply chain relies far too much on foreign sources like Communist China. We can never allow this to happen again. In order to fix that problem, I am pleased that Senate and House negotiators included my request to fund $3.5 billion to utilize 3 existing centers in innovation for advanced development and manufacturing. One of these CIADMs is part of the Texas A&M University system, which I represent. These public-private CIADM partnerships are uniquely positioned to accelerate research, development, and manufacture of vaccines and therapeutics to mitigate pandemics, and they do it right here in America. Today,
from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve my
gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to yield 1 minute to my friend, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the coronavirus emanated from China is here. We can't stop that. We can't go back. But I am distressed by the Hobson's choice that we have. It is ravaging our communities. It is ravaging our healthcare system. It is ravaging our economy. And we should be solely focused on healing our communities and saving the small businesses, the big businesses, and the economy that makes America great. So as we discuss this and also discussed a fourth, yet another package, no more Hobson's choice, no more billion-dollar bailouts for things that are unrelated, no more policies that are long-standing for a short-standing issue that needs our critical attention. Mr. Speaker, whatever we do, let's do no harm. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to my fellow Texan, Dr. Burgess.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for the recognition. Our country is in a war, a crisis, unlike anything that has been seen for over 100 years. But there are heroes. We know our first responders. We know our doctors and nurses on the front line in our intensive care units. We know what heroes they are. But you know, Mr. Speaker, not all heroes wear capes. Certainly our doctors and nurses don't wear capes. I've got a furniture manufacturer in my district, Barbara Caldwell, who called me last weekend and said she wanted to transition her furniture manufacturing to manufacture personal protective equipment, and she is doing so. I had an aircraft manufacturer who said they wanted to manufacture ventilators, and are changing their clean room and hiring the engineers so they can do that. We do have heroes in this country. They don't always wear capes. I also want to recognize the hard work done by the Health Subcommittee staff, J.P. Poliskevitz, Christian Shatansky, Christian Sam, Caleb Graff, and then on my staff, Elizabeth Allen, Casey Pachunka, Rachel Huggins, and my Chief of Staff, James Decker, who are all over in the office right now, making certain that this goes smoothly. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Harris.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we're here a week too late, not because we didn't know what our citizens and businesses needed, but because too many in the congressional swamp felt that you never let a serious crisis go to waste. Filling this important bill with pork and earmarks, like $25 million to the Kennedy Center, $75 million to NPR, $75 million to the National Endowment of the Humanities, instead of more masks and ventilators. But, Mr. Speaker, many Americans do need our thanks. Thank you to the frontline healthcare workers who selflessly and compassionately care for victims of the Wuhan virus. Thank you to President Trump for his leadership and for his transparency with the American people in this time of crisis. Thank you to my anesthesiologist colleagues who've stepped up to the challenge. They're trained in intensive care, and the ventilators on their anesthesia machines could prove critical if this fight escalates. Finally, thank you to all those Americans who have followed the President's recommendation on 15 days to slow the spread of the Wuhan virus. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As all of our colleagues came in yesterday and this morning and make an effort to get back, it was important that we were all home last week. I was home last week and got to talk to her barber. Sole proprietor has his own shop, had to close down because of the order. Now he's going to have an income. I talked to a businessman who said, I'm going to have to lay people off for the first time in 40 years of business, and almost in tears. After this bill passes, he will not have to do that. Or the businesswoman that says I have a rent payment due at the end of the month. After this bill passes, she'll be able to pay her rent. Mr. Speaker, I'm humbled that today I'm going to vote for the largest bill in American history. I think it should make us all a little nervous. But it is after being home, listening to the stories of those in our communities, it is the right thing to do. I encourage to support our communities and support those making our country better. And I'm here to say I'm going to support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to our gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This bill is indeed historic, the largest disaster relief package in American history. I'm disappointed, as many of my constituents are, that much of this bill is not directly related or targeted at emergency relief, but that's the cost of doing business in a divided government in such divided times. Indeed, much that was on the last-minute ideological wish list has been removed and focus returned to the virus and its economic effect. A colleague said earlier this is much like a 9/11 moment. It's up to us today. Highlights include help for our revered veterans, nearly $20 billion for their medical care, homeless vets, and modernizing VA telehealth. Expansion of telehealth into rural America, like my own district, to bridge that gap in rural services technology also. $350 billion in guaranteed SBA loans, cushioning the blow and providing much stability for small businesses so that their employees will have jobs waiting when the all-clear signal finally sounds. It's my hope and prayer this act hits the targets and brings certainty that I hope most of us in this room desire, and importantly, meet the needs of the very
Gentleman's time's expired.
People.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Stability. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the former county executive in Long Island, Tom Suozzi of New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, my father was born in Italy, and he would say, what a country. And my grandfather at family weddings would give advice to the new couples and say, non ci sono rose senza spine. You can't have a rose without the thorns. Well, right now, we mourn the thorns in our country right now. So many people are suffering because of their health, because of their sickness, because they're worried about their family's finances, and because of the deaths that have taken place. But today we have to also celebrate the roses, those essential workers that are working for the common good every single day, the grocery workers, the postal workers, the healthcare workers, the people that are on the front lines every single day looking out for us every single day. And I want to celebrate today the roses of life of Democrats and Republicans coming together for the common good, putting aside ideological purity and working together to try and help people that are facing these desperate times. Mr. Speaker, God bless this country and God bless all of our American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I got in my car and drove to Washington, D.C. from Columbus, Indiana, on behalf of the voters in the Indiana 6th District. I'm here to support President Trump and be a voice for Hoosiers who need relief from this virus now. I've been fully engaged in making sure that this package preserves the health and livelihood of Americans. We need to protect the health of Americans and get them back to work. Congress has come together to provide relief and support for hospitals, families, workers, and small businesses. I came here to fight for Hoosiers' prosperity and the American dream. We can't afford to wait another minute for relief. Let's do our job and get it done. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to Mr. Swalwell from the state of California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will get through this. That's who we are. That's what we do. Throughout our country's history, with leadership and resources, the American people have shown resilience to overcome every crisis we faced. This will be no different. As we meet here in this chamber across America, from Eden Hospital in Castro Valley, California, to hospitals in New York City, our health workers, our doctors, our nurses, our receptionists, the janitors who support them, are toiling away to heal the sick. We see you, we hear you, we need you. And this bill, more than for anyone else, is for you. This relief package also helps the next generation. Student borrowers, people who are working their first jobs and paying off their student loan debt, and without a paycheck find themselves in financial quicksand. This allows you to cancel your payments through the end of the fall and also suspends the accrual of interest. We will get through this. It's just who we are, and it's what we do. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Michigan, Reverend Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act and our President. This pandemic has upended life for everyone. I've heard from workers living from paycheck to paycheck who face an uncertain future. I've heard from struggling farmers. I've heard from small business owners who suddenly can't make payroll or rent. I've heard from courageous healthcare professionals and first responders who desperately need personal protective equipment to continue to care for the sick. These are incredibly trying times. While the CARES Act won't solve every unique challenge, help is on the way. America has faced periods of profound adversity in the past. Each time we prevailed. Together, as Americans, we will do so again. But may we remember that while our nation is locked down, our Creator God is wide open to our prayers. Let's
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I am very proud to yield to one of the first 2 Native American women to serve in the Congress of the United States. And this bill, of course, reaches out to our tribal communities to make sure that they're whole. I yield to Ms. Holland from New Mexico.
Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this global crisis causes us to ask, How do we value the workers who grow and harvest our food? How do we value healthcare workers who risk their own lives for our loved ones? How do we value the people who educate and care for our children? Democrats fought hard to ensure this bill includes comprehensive support for healthcare workers. It also creates a $150 billion relief fund so that state, local, and tribal governments can fight this pandemic. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. This stimulus package provides direct payments to working families so they can pay bills. The Small Business Rescue Plan will aid small businesses and nonprofits in New Mexico to maintain their existing workforce and pay rent. Yet still, Congress must continue to act. Even after we stop the spread of this virus, we must ensure our families have the help they need. I support the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act because we must battle this threat together. And Chairman, I yield.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 is hitting our country hard and fast, but Americans across our country and in my home district in Northeast Ohio are rallying together to confront and overcome this latest challenge. In Ohio's 16th district, we have seen restaurateurs with now empty dining rooms making free meals for students in Green Local School District. We have seen businesses like Bueller's Grocers do everything they can to prevent layoffs and support employees who come to work every day to ensure their shelves are stocked for those who need it. Our hospitals are bracing for impact, but we have seen our healthcare providers like the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals working their hardest to innovate through this crisis by developing their own tests and launching drive-through testing facilities. Our great governor, Mike DeWine, is setting the gold standard of leadership in response to this crisis. He is taking decisive action to flatten the curve and save lives in the Buckeye State. This bill provides critical resources for those who need it most: our heroic healthcare workers, our small businesses, the unemployed, and our local leaders who are fighting this virus on the front lines.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I vote yes.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Staten Island, who himself has been on the front lines fighting for freedom and now fighting for our people. Max
Thank
Rose.
you, sir.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this bill because each and every day, New Yorkers, people in my own community are dying. I rise today in support of this bill because our frontline soldiers of this war, our nurses and our doctors, need masks. I rise today because days from now, weeks from now, New Yorkers will need thousands of more ventilators. I rise today because hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers have been laid off. And I rise today in support of this bill because this virus doesn't see party affiliation, and today we rise as Americans, not Democrats or Republicans. And lastly, I rise today in support of this bill because this is just the beginning. More work will need to be done. New York needs more help. But we're Americans, and we can get the job done. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I rise in strong support of the CARES Act. COVID-19, otherwise known as the coronavirus, has seriously impacted our country both medically and economically. During this unprecedented time, it's imperative that we not only take proper precautions, but react in an effective manner. This bill is not perfect. It has a very large price tag. However, a crisis of this magnitude requires Congress to act swiftly and decisively. This bill represents a bipartisan compromise that can make this happen. We have single household incomes, seniors on fixed incomes, and small business owners who need relief right now. My constituency is still rebuilding after Hurricane Michael, and I intend to do whatever it takes to get them the help they need right away. This is an excellent opportunity for us all to come together and support our constituents. Please join me in supporting this stimulus package, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to stand here today and to say to my constituents in Phillipsburg and Dover and Clark who are out of work, to our restaurant owners in Somerville and Summit, to our nurses and doctors at Overlook and Hunterdon Medical, help is on the way. This does not mean we're done. There's so much more to do for our local governments, for example, for our hospitals and healthcare system. Congress must keep working. Let's use technology. Let's use remote voting. Let's have virtual hearings to make sure this money we're approving goes out the door quickly and to the right people. And let's remember, we are not here today rescuing the economy because of a virus. We are rescuing the economy because of our failure as a nation to test for that virus. So Congress will do our job. We will take care of the economy. I implore the President to work with us, Republicans and Democrats, to fix the supply chain for masks, for ventilators, for test kits.
Time's expired.
Don't talk about reopening America
till
we've done what we must to reopen it safely.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Think of this. Doesn't it feel like it was just yesterday the Federal Reserve Chairman was telling us we were in the Goldilocks economy? The wage growth, particularly wage growth for the working poor, was the best in modern economic times. I will argue we need to find a path back to that. That economic growth was moral. It was an amazing thing. Good things were happening. And then we hit this black swan. This is ripping my heart out because there's things in this bill that just don't belong there. I consider them, well, I can't say that word in front of a microphone, but we all have these moments in our political lives where we walk up front of this microphone and we're going to say, I'm going to have to vote for something that has things in it that break my heart, but we must do the right thing. We must get back to that economic growth. We must get back to that prosperity that was enveloping this country. And hopefully, we will look back, do a great postmortem, understand the things we did wrong, and fix them in the future.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to my friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Steve Lynch.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlelady from Wyoming. Although in recounting the heroes of 9/11, she forgot the United States Postal Service workers, and we have forgotten them in this bill. During 9/11, the United States Postal Service workers continued to deliver the mail despite the anthrax attacks, and they continued to deliver medical supplies and medicines to every home and business in America today 6 days a week, yet they receive no benefits in this bill. We need them also to execute a delivery by mail system, a vote by mail system in this crisis to preserve our democracy as this crisis continues. So we need to fix that in the upcoming, in the next bill that we consider for this type of relief. We have to remember the United States postal workers and the great job they've done on behalf of our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, these unprecedented times call for unity to help Hoosiers and all Americans who are struggling medically and or financially through no fault of their own. This relief package puts Americans first with aid for families, workers, small businesses, and companies that employ millions of people. There's assistance for healthcare providers who are on the front lines working tirelessly to save our friends, neighbors, and family members from COVID-19, in addition to their usual duties. I'm proud to see that 2 provisions I've helped author are included in this package. These bipartisan policies will ensure patients have timely and affordable access to COVID-19 preventive care, such as vaccines and testing, and to make clear doctors who provide volunteer medical services during this public health emergency have liability protections. I've spent the past week talking to hospitals in Indiana, and it could not be clearer. They need our help, just as we need their help to defeat the virus and keep our loved ones safe. I urge my colleagues to support this package so we can provide relief Americans desperately need. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. I rise today in favor of this bill, but also to say thank you to my brothers and sisters who are on the front line. Yes, those who work in the supermarkets, who are delivering the mail, who keep the lights on, who keep the water running. We're thanking them because they're making the sacrifice today. We've always been tough. Americans are special, and we will rise to this occasion. Fate calls us, we will answer, and we want to say thank you to everyone here and to all those serving America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the former chairman of the Energy Committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's face it, coronavirus has totally disrupted our lives across the country, in every community, and certainly around the globe. To all of us, it's frightening. It's a nightmare. This bill is a partial response to end that disruption. It provides our medical workers and our hospitals, our small businesses, and virtually every family needed assistance. So to you who oppose this bill, please stand down. We can't wait another day to help. Don't add to this disruption by, in fact, being a disruptor. Be a leader. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, again, I have the opportunity to yield to one of our most senior members, the gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee. 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I join my friend from Michigan. There should be no one that rises to object in spite of the fact that we know there are challenges in this bill. But I hear these words: we are scared, we are stressed, the words of an emergency room doctor. These are the ones that are on the front lines right now today, when we have the largest number of cases in the whole nation and over 1,100 dead. Now we have $500 billion for industries with oversight, $350 billion for small businesses that include the micro businesses, the gig economies, and faith institutions and nonprofits. I will fight to make sure all of our nonprofits get it, all for direct payment for individuals, as well as $100 billion for hospitals. I watched as the Memorial Medical Center gave out over 1,100 tests, a small hospital putting themselves on the front line. Here's my words, Mr. Speaker. No man is an island. Each man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. The gentlelady is no longer recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, these are challenging times for our country. Yet throughout our history, America has risen to every challenge, and today is no different. I want to thank our President, Donald Trump, for his strong leadership during this crisis. Now, I don't like everything in this bill. While we've kept out dangerous provisions like union bailouts, the Green New Deal, and election schemes, it still has items I don't agree with, and I worry about the price tag. However, families, hospitals, and small businesses need immediate relief. I'm talking about a small business in Concord where the owner's doing his best, but still had to furlough many of his 30 employees. He told me he can put most of his employees back on the payroll using the SBA 7A loan program in this bill. It's workers and small businesses like this one that are counting on this legislation. It's not perfect, but I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Ohio, Joyce Beatty.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, the world is watching us. Today's $2 trillion aid is relief and economic security for all Americans. We worked hard to provide health care disaster needs and to ensure Americans and workers and families come first. $350 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses, independent contractors like barbershops and beauty salons and more. First-time funding for not-for-profits and churches, which we must include minorities minority-led and minority-serving not-for-profits, $1,200 in direct payment to individuals and couples, $500 to children. The nation is watching us.
Expired.
Vote for this bill.
Gentleman
Thank
from
you.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of Congress, I've spoken with constituents, business owners, and community leaders over the last few weeks who are apprehensive about their health and financial security. As a practicing physician, I've spoken with numerous infectious disease physicians, scientists, epidemiologists about the present COVID-19 threat. While there are several provisions in this bill that are not necessary, I'd rather not dwell on its imperfections, and I will support it. Instead, I'd like to thank House and Senate members, as well as Secretary Mnuchin and President Trump, for negotiating a bipartisan deal in a timely manner to provide relief to the American people. The CARES Act provides desperately needed funding to those who need it in this unprecedented time in this nation's history. Families, small businesses, churches, community institutions will receive the funding that they need to stay viable while we continue to fight the outbreak of COVID-19. I would like to urge employers to keep their employees employed and access the benefits that this bill provides to keep them financially afloat.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas
I'd like to thank
reserves.
our health care workers.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
30 seconds.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Brad Sherman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
This virus is a machine gunning America. This bill provides $2 trillion to bandage some of the wounds. We must stop the machine gun. Less than 1% of this bill goes for medical research. Our economic system provides significant incentives to the private sector to research patented drugs, but we should do more. The next bill should provide $5 billion to the NIH to evaluate every reasonable research alternative, particularly those compounds that the private sector will not investigate.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. I yield back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the CARES Act. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly affected the health and livelihoods of people around the globe. Mr. Speaker, this bill, it's not perfect, but it's a solid step forward to providing the relief needed to revive our economy. There's no doubt that as a nation, we've endured tough times in our history, but we've always come back stronger and more resilient. I'm proud today to be here representing West Tennessee during this trying time.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we've never faced a public health threat of this magnitude. Hardworking people have lost their jobs and are on the edge of making rent or putting food on the table. That's why our rescue efforts have been focused on people. This bill offers additional unemployment benefits, injects billions into our healthcare system, provides billions to small businesses to keep their workers on payroll, and gives every eligible adult a $1,200 check or $500 for every eligible child. However, this bill isn't perfect. It leaves out immigrants who contribute to our economy, pay taxes, and are also on the front lines of this pandemic. This virus does not discriminate based on immigration status or race, and our response shouldn't either. However, despite that, this shortcoming, I do plan to vote for this bill, and I urge all my colleagues to do the same. Hardworking families are at risk, where they need help now. Many lives
Gentlelady's
are at
time's
stake.
expired.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the ranking Republican of Homeland Appropriations. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. To my colleagues in this great House, the People's House, we have been here in times of triumph and in times of tragedy. This is the latter. It is a time for civility, it is a time for unity, and it is a time for us to serve the American people and pass this bill. Let our resolve be to defeat this virus. No malady, no virus, no adversity will ever erode the great American Republic. God bless us all, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to another former member of the armed forces who has seen combat face to face and knows what crisis we have today, Mikey Sherrill from the state of New Jersey.
1 minute. Gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
1 minute.
I rise today with an incredible amount of pride to speak for the people of New Jersey, to speak for the heroes in healthcare who have labored around the clock to provide the best care in the nation. I rise for those workers and for the first responders who are running out of personal protective gear. I rise for the brave men and women who are going through these tough times to help us, the grocery store workers, delivery people, volunteers bringing food to the elderly and the sick. I rise for our manufacturers, our researchers, our state and local officials, and I rise for everyday families, small business owners and laborers who are losing their jobs and not sure what the future holds. I rise for everyone in my great state to tell you that together we will beat this. In Congress, I will continue to work to get you the relief you need, and this nation, we, as a people, have always come together in a crisis, and I've seen firsthand that this time is no different. And so I rise today to ask that God bless this House, God bless the state of New Jersey, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Spino.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to speak in favor of the CARES Act with optimism. On one hand, cautious optimism because we face unprecedented challenges. But on the other, confident optimism of what can be accomplished when we work together. We come together for those who bravely working on the front lines of the fight, our nurses and doctors at Lakeland Regional, Brandon Regional, South Lake Hospital, one of the many other medical providers across my district. We come together for families, like the single mom who worked 2 jobs in Florida's tourism industry to keep food on the table, but now doesn't know when her next paycheck will come. We come together to support the backbone of our economy, small business. I've spoken to many small business owners this week who are desperately trying to figure out how to keep their employees. And as a former small business owner myself, I understand the decisions that you are facing. As a fiscal conservative, I'm cautious about this bill, but I understand the cost our country would pay without it. When we face adversity, we rise to confront the threat head on. But for those in Florida's 15th district and around the country, remain optimistic because we will win this fight together. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my colleague from Maryland, David Trone.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, our nation has never seen anything like the coronavirus outbreak. At a time when our American business are forced to close and American families face fear and uncertainty, we do what Americans do best. We come together and support one another. My background is business. I run a small business and a large organization. This bill puts workers first. It's good for the American business. Puts workers first with additional $600 a week in unemployment insurance. Puts families first, funneling $1,200 directly into the pockets of Americans. Supports small business with $377 billion infusion for fast relief grants and loans. This bill is what the American people and the American economy need. It's time to come together as one nation, united against this outbreak. I urge support for this bill and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
A month ago, our nation stood on the highest mountaintop, marveling at the supposed limitlessness of our domain. Today, barely 3 weeks later, awakening from an abundance-induced stupor, we find ourselves deep in the valley, peering perilously into the abyss. I hope that the safety net we are attempting to purchase today with our nation's scarce treasure doesn't dull too much the alarm that this crisis has sounded for our country to reform its ways. I pray that from this low point, we will seek out a great revival of faith in our Almighty God and a renewed commitment to the principles of freedom, liberty, and self-reliance. For those in this Congress who have used this crisis to loot the public treasury and serve special interests above the common good, I trust that our people and history will judge you as harshly as you deserve. And today I give thanks for our president.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished colleague from Maine, Mr. Jarrett.
The gentleman from Maine is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, thousands of Mainers are staying home and doing their part to bend the curve in the fight against the coronavirus. But thousands of healthcare professionals, shipbuilders, grocery store employees, and many others deemed essential got up this morning and went to work. They'll do their jobs in this difficult time despite the risk because people depend on them. Congress shouldn't be any different. We're about to vote on a bill in response to the pandemic sweeping through our nation and the growing economic crisis that follows it. Nearly 900 pages long, my office received the text a little over 24 hours ago. I'll be honest, many of us are still working to understand this bill in full. Portions drafted by lobbyists with loopholes you might drive a Mack truck through. Only time will tell whether this behemoth will fully deliver on its economic promises. It won't fully stop the deepening recession. Only the loosening of the tourniquet will let the blood flow back into our economy, but that is not yet an option. I will, however, support this Relief Act. It's not a stimulus, it's an emergency relief act, providing $100 billion to hospitals.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from
Thank you
Virginia
very much.
reserves.
I appreciate
Gentleman
it.
from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we're here today debating a massive stimulus bill, not by choice, but by duty. The coronavirus is an unseen enemy that threatens countless American lives, a nuclear bomb to our economy. Yesterday, we learned a record 3 million plus Americans have filed for unemployment. Workers are hurting, small businesses are hurting, thousands of Americans are sick. Health experts tell us we have several more weeks of this collective suffering ahead. But there is good news, lots of it. Americans from coast to coast are pitching in to help the cause. Businesses are changing their production lines to make ventilators and hand sanitizer. Surgical masks are being donated by the millions, and we're lining up to give blood. Healthcare workers are being cheered like rock stars during shift changes. Americans are pulling together. Everyday heroes are emerging teachers, teaching their classes over the internet. Doctors and nurses working superhuman shifts while friends and neighbors step up to provide child care for them. We're seeing the best of America. Now the House must do its part. Vote yes.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Mary Gay Scanlon, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute. Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to support the CARES Act, the third relief package that will pass through the House this month, and we know it's not the last. This bill will help protect the health, safety, and economic security of all Americans. I want to say that I'm so grateful to our state and local officials, our first responders and healthcare workers, our postal and grocery workers, all of whom are fighting for our communities. And I'm grateful to our friends and neighbors for listening to our medical experts and staying home to slow the spread of the coronavirus. But they can't do it alone. As the numbers of patients and deaths are mounting, our doctors and nurses are telling us they're working without the protective gear and medical equipment they need. We need to end the disconnect between what the president is saying and what is really happening in America. We need the president to use the Defense Production Act to produce and distribute the medical supplies we need. I'm so grateful to our colleagues for moving quickly to pass this bill and help the American people, and I urge the president to do the same. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from
Texas.
Texas is recognized.
The great state of Texas. Thank you. I yield Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to Mr. Raskus, Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a historic moment in the U.S. House.
We need to pass an unprecedented economic package that will prevent financial disaster for millions of Americans. We must get people working again. This bill funds programs for small businesses, including independent contractors and nonprofits. It provides up to $1,200 for taxpayers who earn $75,000 or less, as well as $500 per child. Additionally, seniors and disabled veterans are also eligible for checks. These payments will not be considered taxable income for 2020, Mr. Speaker. Most importantly, critical funding to provide personal equipment and test kits for healthcare professionals is on the way. For sure, this is a spending bill. I'm not happy with everything, but I will vote yes to save the lives and livelihood of my constituents. I ask for swift passage as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate it very much.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserved. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished lady from Michigan, Elise Slotkin.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Think about the most iconic images from 9/11. Just after the attacks, people running away from the towers as our first responders were running towards the flame. It was a generational event. Today, as so many stay home, those who are running towards the crisis are our healthcare workers, our first responders. They are on the front lines. Our supermarket workers, our truck drivers, our border agents and TSA agents. Right now, we are sending them into the fight without the gear that they need. We owe them our passion. We owe them to work together, Democrats and Republicans. And above all, we owe them a plan. Meanwhile, Americans are doing their best. Michiganders are coming together in ways that I could hardly imagine, from the big three autos to our smallest manufacturers, trying to fill the gaps. Today, here, we must do our part. We must pass the CARES Act. It is imperfect. It is the third appropriation. I hope there will be a fourth, but it is our duty to come together and pass it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the pain being felt in South Jersey and in this nation is real. I have listened and I have heard the stories. What we're doing today will soothe some of the pain, but it's just the beginning. America was founded and has thrived with the idea that we are an exceptional nation. We are exceptional, not because of our differences, but because of what unites us in times of adversity. This legislation is a testament to our strength that we show in that unity. While we must maintain a physical distance from one another to slow the curve of our hidden enemy, we must remain closer than ever in our hearts and in our souls to one another. I stand with my colleagues ready to fight this disease, fight for our families, fight for their jobs, and fight to keep our nation. May God bless America, and may God bless all of us as we go forward with our work.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Hoyer.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today in support of the CARES Act. At this time, our country needs this Congress to act with a bipartisan commitment to ensuring the safety and the well-being of our constituents. Although this package is not perfect, we must support our postal workers. We must ensure our municipalities have the funding to survive. But it will provide immediately workers, families, and health professionals and first responders the resources that they need. Today, we can provide direct cash infusion into our economy, and we will provide more than $170 billion to support and purchase the needed PPEs and give our hospitals grants to offset the revenue and losses. However, our work is not done. As confirmed cases in Michigan and across the country continue to rise, I will work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisles to address the outstanding issues. And I want to say, God bless America, and we need to do our work. I yield back.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the people of Central Kentucky in support of the most aggressive fiscal stimulus in American history. Founding Father John Adams famously said that every problem is an opportunity in disguise, and this insidious virus and the resulting shutdown of our economy is a very serious problem. But because of the spirit of the American people, it is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to support the heroic work of America's hospitals and healthcare workers and doctors and give them the resources they need to stay safe and take care of the sick. It's an opportunity to go to war against this virus and unleash the creative energies of America's private sector and help our scientists and researchers find therapies, a vaccine, and a cure. It's an opportunity to give American workers, small business owners, and families the cash flow they need to get back to work. It's an opportunity to provide liquidity and financial support to our markets to fuel a powerful economic recovery. And it's an opportunity to come together as a nation, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans to rise to the occasion as we have done so many times before to confront this challenge and deliver a stronger, healthier, and more prosperous
from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I get the time remaining for both sides?
Yes, the Majority Leader, you have 22 minutes, and the opposing side, or the other side, 31 minutes.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Who are we calling on here? Page, who we have? Bill Huizenga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the people of West Michigan for the individuals and families who have seen their world turned upside down by COVID-19. Our neighbors, friends, and family members are losing their income, small businesses are closing their doors, and manufacturers, big and small, are shuttering their facilities. All this is happening not because of bad business decisions or personal choices, but because of a virus. The CARES Act will deliver critical relief to West Michigan residents, small businesses, and our medical professionals. This package will help tens of thousands of constituents in my district stay employed. While I don't agree with every proposal included in this bill, the vast majority of it will work directly to provide relief to the people who need it most. Communities across the nation expect this body to act today. And finally, I want to say thank you to the first responders, nurses, and doctors who are serving our communities on the front lines. Thank you for the farmers, the food processors, the truck drivers, and those stocking the shelves to make sure goods are available in this time of need. We're all in this together, Mr. Speaker. God bless America. Let's pass this bill.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Is Mr. Buck here? Please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose the CARES Act. I agree we are facing an unprecedented emergency, one tied directly to China's nefarious actions. However, as President Trump said, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. The President has shown strong leadership, seeking to help struggling families and small businesses. Congress must do the same, but we can't do so at the expense of our children and our grandchildren's future. The truth is this bill will spend $6 trillion, not $2 trillion. Even that cost fails to include the cost of borrowing this money. There is no attempt by Congress to reduce spending elsewhere in the budget to pay for this bill. The sad truth is that most of this money in this bill is unrelated to fighting the coronavirus. We believe that the fight against the virus will take 6 to 8 weeks, yet this bill spends money decades into the future. While it is clearly necessary to do something to help our country fight this disease, this bill is not the answer. Our country needs help.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We're doing that.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Leader, Mr. Speaker, at this time, just like I said last week, I say it again this week. The COVID-19 pandemic will get worse before it gets better. It will get worse for our public health. It will get worse for our financial health. And that is why I rise in support of the CARES Act. With these shelter-in-place orders, we are continuing to trying to flatten the corona curve. But when we do that, figuratively, we are putting our economy in a medically induced coma. A step that, as we've seen this week, has led to one of the worst employment rates in our history. That is why we need one of the biggest stimulus packages in our history. The CARES Act will expand unemployment insurance for restaurant, retail, and hotel workers on the central coast of California. It will assist my specialty crop farmers in the salad and berry bowls of the world. And it will provide small businesses across this country with the loans necessary to survive. With this bruising pandemic, we are asking our constituents to do something that's not normal, to stand down, to stay inside, to separate from one another.
Gentleman's time
they
is
are relying
expired.
on us
Gentleman from
to do the right
Maryland
thing, to step up and to support the CARES Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as a fiscal conservative, $2.2 trillion of our grandchildren's money is a tough pill to swallow. But this is a two-front war on our economy and on public health. On the economic front, we must provide a lifeline to individuals, businesses, seniors that are suffering collateral damage. And on the health front, we must send reinforcements to our healthcare workers. This morning, I spoke with a physician and family member heading into the emergency room in Manhattan. She said she's scared. Like combat, I told her, you have to take a deep breath, stay focused, and do what you're trained to do. These hospitals are the Omaha Beach of this war. Colleagues, in the foxhole, nobody cares about race, religion, creeds, socioeconomic background. They certainly don't care about Republican and Democrat. It's about mission. It's about country. We have a duty to provide these soldiers what they need. We have a duty to support this bill. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I think that's changed. Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 10 days, I've seen the very best of America. I've seen restaurants like Umi Seafood and Lucille's Barbecue in Fort Wayne deliver thousands of meals to those who need it. I've seen T&T Floral Shop in Columbia City deliver flowers to every nursing home resident in my county. I've seen many lining up to donate blood. And I've seen so many healthcare professionals put themselves in harm's way on the front lines. Mr. Speaker, it's time for Congress to join them and bring relief to our neighbors who needed it yesterday. The CARES Act will keep the lights on in America. It will put cash in the hands of Americans who need help to pay their bills and put food on the table. And it will give a lifeline to small businesses when they need it most. This is by no means a perfect bill, but it gets help to the people who need it most. And I hope we will come back and make changes as needed in the near future. Mr. Speaker, in this time of national crisis, we must continue working together and with President Trump to keep our country in the fight. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 didn't kill our economy. Government policies, however well-intentioned, did that. In just a few weeks, they've derailed the most promising and prosperous economy of our lifetimes and put us in imminent danger of permanently destroying millions of American jobs. The unprecedented spending in this bill threatens to destabilize the fiscal structure of our federal government and suppress future economic growth. But in order to deal with those issues, we must first arrest the damage caused by the actions that have plunged us into a recession. Temporary job losses will soon become permanent job losses without federally guaranteed loans to preserve those jobs and a way for families to recoup their financial losses. This bill does so, although inefficiently, wastefully, and at enormous cost. Despite all its flaws, passage of this bill is therefore imperative. But it is no substitute for getting Americans back to
Gentleman
work
from
soon.
Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished colleague from Massachusetts, Ms. Trahan.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of this Congress, Democrats have committed themselves to a For the People agenda. Today is no different. The COVID-19 pandemic is impacting people across the world, our country, my district. And it is for the people that we stand here today to assist families, uplift workers whose basic livelihoods have been threatened, strengthen our community hospitals, and support our frontline healthcare workers. We are here to deliver relief to people, like the owner of a community bookstore in Andover, Massachusetts, whose business has been crushed, to keep our end of the bargain for the hospital workers at places like Lawrence General and Lowell Community Health Center, and so many others who are putting their lives on the line each day. And we are here for the families who are worried about their basic health and safety. This bill delivers for them. This is a time for bold action, and much more needs to come. For families struggling with the harsh realities of this situation, know that we will keep protecting you. We will take our lessons and courage from our frontline workers, from the families banding together to care for their loved ones, from the acts of kindness we are seeing all over our country as we stand united as Americans.
Gentleman
I support
from Virginia
this bill.
reserves.
Thank you. I yield
from
back.
Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remaining on both sides?
You have 20. Gentleman has 26 minutes, and the majority has 20 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Really pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, during times like this, it brings out the best and the worst. The best has been a president who's working nonstop. The best have been those businesses who are producing the masks and the things that we need. The best has been the churches that are praying nonstop. Now, the worst has been the price tag, and the worst has been the things that were added to this that had nothing to do with the coronavirus. So $25 million for the Kennedy Center, $75 million for the National Arts. This has nothing to do with the coronavirus. This nation shall survive, and in the words of Winston Churchill, there are times when doing our best isn't good enough. We will do what's required in spite of this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to our friend from Florida, Mr. DeSoto.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as I rise here today, the United States has more coronavirus cases than any nation on the planet. This is an unprecedented crisis that requires an unprecedented response. This bipartisan bill is a promise that help is on the way. That help is on the way for families with $1,200 checks and $2,400 for married families, for food assistance, for the unemployed. Help is on the way with $600 in unemployment benefits on top of state benefits. Help is on the way for our seniors and our veterans with financial assistance. Help is on the way with small businesses through payroll grants and other costs. First responders and hospitals, help is on the way to confront this crisis. And to our farmers and to our students, help is on the way. It's time to pass this bipartisan bill and send a message to Central Florida and every American across every corner of this nation that there is help, because help and hope are on the way.
Gentleman's time. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members are asked to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman from Texas may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that this bill was delayed in pursuit of certain wasteful provisions that have nothing to do with the coronavirus. With that said, I'm thankful that the vast majority of this bill rightly focuses on the needs of Americans. It will save small business in my district, provides much-needed funds to the hospitals on the front lines of this fight, and provides a safety net for people who lose their jobs due to no fault of their own. America is hurting. The American people need us now more than ever. Thanks to Leader McCarthy and President Trump and the members involved for their unrelenting work on this. To the American people, it is much later than anyone wanted, but help is on the way. I urge a yes vote. May God bless us all. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to our friend from California, Mr. Cox.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of today's bill, which is a bipartisan, good faith effort to begin to provide relief to millions of American families and workers. And while not perfect, it's a good start. In the last few weeks, I spoke to thousands of my Central Valley neighbors. Last week, I had a town hall where 9,000 constituents called in. They're scared, they're worried, but they're looking for guidance and leadership. And today, they're looking for relief. No American should have to go between paying rent and putting food on their table. But without immediate assistance, this is exactly the choice they'll have to make. As a representative of the top ag district in the top ag state, I'm proud this bill shores up vital safety net programs for our farmers, ranchers, and their families. But I'm disappointed about this bill's glaring shortcomings, which must be remedied in a future bill. This bill punishes mixed status households and denies some American citizens benefits they deserve. It does not put a penny in the
Gentleman's
CDFI
time's
fund.
expired. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
We've gone from a story that barely affected Americans 3 weeks ago to a $2 trillion bill today. The cost is too high, but the crisis in response to government experts may be right and may be wrong, who said don't fly, don't eat out, don't worship together, don't go to school. Our economy was shattered. Was our president held up by irresponsible Democrats and too many irresponsible Republicans for excessive spending? Yes, but we must act to calm the panic and move back to normalcy. I flew here yesterday on the only Southwest flight from Milwaukee with 5 passengers. Usually there are 2 almost full flights. Restaurants are shuttered by the government and their employees are laid off. President Trump is right to act and stand up to the purists who would let businesses go under or who don't understand that even the greatest of presidents have had to compromise. I'm concerned about the unemployment benefits going over $900 a week, more than most Wisconsin people make. I want to help Americans laid off, but this provision delays the recovery, and I hope Americans don't bite on it. Stand with the president. Thank
Gentleman
you.
from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
He's got the updates.
I yield to the distinguished member from California, Mr. Carter. No. Yeah.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had 2 obligations in responding to this pandemic. First, to move quickly and urgently, and second, to put science and health ahead of partisan politics. Neither of those 2 things happened. But this bill is a step forward. It helps all the workers who have lost their jobs. It helps the businesses that are struggling with customers not showing up and staying home. And it helps the frontline nurses, doctors, first responders who need more equipment. There is more to do. As soon as we pass this bill, we need to keep working to make sure that we're expanding paid leave, to expand access to health care, and to make sure that we continue to protect each and every person who is out there as a first responder. But until then, I want to thank my friends on both sides of the aisle for working to get this done, and I urge us to pass it as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and please yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting hearing all this talk about we got to do it now, got to do it now. It's been delayed since last weekend because of our friends across the aisle. And then also, regarding the bill that we previously passed, it exempted the big corporations we're now hearing is so evil. So we need to get our story consistent here. But thank goodness the president put a travel ban in while some were trying to conspire, spy, impeach, but he kept being persistent, and as a result, there are fewer people with the disease. Now, $2 trillion is vastly too much money. but I spent much of the night reviewing all the sunsets in the bill. I'm satisfied that most of them will prevent most of the waste, but there's some pet projects in here. But it's time to turn back to the God that so many have turned from, and then use the tools we've got to help those that have been put in jeopardy. I will vote for the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Speaker, I now have the privilege of yielding to the distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Jim Clyburn of South Carolina.
How much time?
1 minute.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. I just want to take a moment to thank all of my colleagues for responding to what is an unprecedented event in the history of this country. Many of us who have studied history know full well that the country has been here before, and we have always recovered. The problem is, many times, that recovery is uneven. And what we have done with this legislation is created the opportunity to have a more equitable recovery taking place. And I thank you all for doing that. The fact of the matter is, this is a great country which does not have to be made great again. What we've got to do is make this country's greatness accessible and affordable for all Americans. This legislation makes an attempt to do that, and I would hope that as we go forward, we will build upon it. And when we come back, which we will have an equitable society for all. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
By the way, Mr. Speaker, you're doing a fine job today. Thank you.
Well, you all are doing a fine job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, throughout our history, the American people have mobilized in extraordinary and unprecedented ways in times of national crisis. But the enemy we face today has required a different response. To defeat COVID-19, we have asked most Americans to do what comes so unnaturally to them: stay home. We have asked businesses to shutter, employees to stop going to work, and churches to close. Entire industries have lost their consumer base overnight. The American people didn't cause this crisis, but are responding the way they always do, by being smart, tough, and compassionate. We owe it to them to give them this support. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, not because it's perfect or even sufficient, but because the lives and the livelihoods of Americans are at risk. And so this bill provides immediate cash assistance. It allows for unemployment benefits. It puts direct money in the hands of small businesses who are struggling in my district. It creates $100 million in assistance to hospitals, something Minnesota hospitals are desperately in need of. And it creates $150 billion in necessary funding for state
Gentleman from
and
Maryland
local
reserves.
government.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to vote yes enthusiastically. This is a big bill, but the American people are bigger. They will respond to the present threat as Americans have always faced grave challenges. As free men and women with deep reservoirs of strength, capability, and when summoned, duty and confidence. It is the duty of some to mobilize this government to backstop the economy, the duty of some to isolate, to blunt the contagion, the duty of some to face the risk tending the afflicted, and fellow Americans, the duty of the rest of us to mobilize the unstoppable force of the American economy to provide supplies, innovate technologies, and enlarge healthcare capacities to meet the needs of all and to defeat this enemy. With God's help, this virus is no match for the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, one time, because we're getting towards the end, can you give us the time that each side has?
The majority has, the gentleman from Maryland has 15.5 minutes. Gentleman from Texas has 20 minutes.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are good parts of this bill. The things President Trump asked for at the very beginning, like tax relief for employers, help for those who lost their jobs, funding for the medical community and first responders. And I thank President Trump for his excellent leadership. I had a couple ideas I'd like to offer as amendments to this bill, but this is a closed process. 435 members of Congress can't even offer amendments. That's not the way we're supposed to make legislation, especially one that spends $2 trillion. There are parts of this bill that's also unrelated to the coronavirus, $1 billion for Amtrak, money for National Public Radio and the arts. But what we're not talking about is how we're going to pay for this. $2 trillion. We all agree about spending $2 trillion, but how do you pay for it? We're going to borrow it from China? We're going to borrow it from Russia? We're just going to print the money and devalue our current currency? That's not being talked about. The interest on the national debt every year is already about $500 billion every year going forward. So going forward, we need to talk about balancing our budget and paying for things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back, balance my time.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last week, 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment. Small businesses around this country are shuttering. Millions of Americans and their children are at home practicing social distancing, a term that few knew 2 weeks ago. Countless others are on the front lines in our hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmacies, or simply checking us out at the grocery store. Yesterday, I spoke to many small businesses in my district on a call. I was asked to give them hope. To the American people who are watching, there is hope, and help is on the way. There are many things in this bill I do not like. There are portions that I think are a mistake. But, colleagues, this is our time for action. Do not hold this bill up. We owe it to the citizens of this great country who are struggling. We owe action for them today, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last pandemic. I want to draw attention to the research investments in the CARES Act. The Department of Energy has funds for its high-end computing capabilities. The National Science Foundation will do molecular and cellular research. NIST will ensure the validity and the reliability of the testing. And the EPA will do research on the risk of transmission. Mr. Speaker, my grandfather lost his wife and first son in the flu epidemic in 1919. Yet this is not the last novel virus. But with a bold, sustained commitment to science, we can make COVID-19 the last pandemic. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, our country finds ourselves in uncharted waters. None of us have ever experienced anything like this before. For the past 2 weeks, I've been at home in the 1st District of Georgia, visiting with individuals, with small business owners. I've seen something I've never seen before. I've seen people who are concerned about their health, concerned about their future. Mr. Speaker, this is something we have to address. I've also seen something I've never seen before either. And that is people pulling together, people doing for each other, people caring for each other, volunteering at food banks, volunteering at service organizations. I've seen healthcare workers putting their own health at risk to deliver services. I've seen the best of America as well. Mr. Speaker, it is our opportunity here, our responsibility to help these people, to deliver to them. No, this is not a perfect bill. If I had an opportunity, I'd change a number of things in it, but it is what we need to do, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, more than anything, what we need to do is we need to pray. We need to pray to the God of Abraham, to the God of David.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Michigan, Dan Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. This is an unprecedented moment for this country, and it's important that this Congress respond in a way consistent with this threat. We have differences about this bill. There are things in it that many of us don't like. But this moves us forward. This gives the American people the support they need in order to follow the medical advice that they are given without putting their families at risk. It supports small businesses. It puts money in the hands of Americans so that they can take care of their families financially while they're taking care of the health of their families. I support this legislation.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, General Bergman.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This legislation takes major steps to support American workers and families during this unprecedented time. It provides increased funding to get our healthcare workers essential supplies and equipment. It also helps small businesses who have been asked to close their doors and sacrifice their livelihoods for everyone's health and safety. This bill is not perfect. I'm disappointed that we're paying for things that don't have anything to do with COVID-19. And I'm concerned about inadvertent damage we may be doing to our seasonal businesses by incentivizing people to stay at home rather than go back to work once shelter-in-place restrictions are lifted. Small seasonal businesses are the lifeblood of Michigan's 1st District, and as we implement this policy, I will do everything I can to prevent unintended consequences from happening. The people of Michigan's 1st District are resilient. We have survived hardships before, and we will again. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Gentlelady from New Hampshire is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to support this unprecedented emergency relief for the American people. My colleague Chris Pappas and I have spoken with tens of thousands of our constituents through telephone town halls and conference calls with hospitals. I want to support for our people who have lost their jobs, for our small businesses, but most importantly for our frontline healthcare workers in our rural hospitals. We need supplies. We need support. Thank you for voting yes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Businesses large and small, through no fault of their own, are failing. We told them to shut down, and workers are losing their jobs. And let me clear something up for everyone. A lost job is a lost job, whether from a large business or a small business. And it's devastating for families. Americans need help. Thankfully, this bill covers it all, from direct aid to accelerated loans. But when every day counts in a crisis, this bill was delayed by Democrats unnecessarily for a totally unrelated progressive wish list. I don't get mad, but this made me mad. And in the end, the final bill today is barely different than last weekend. And the record will show that. But we have it now, and we should pass it now. It will soften the upcoming hardship, but we must not be complacent, for we have more difficult decisions ahead. How will we balance the opening of society with the pandemic? It's a tough question, and we won't be able to answer that question if the antics of this week continue. The country wants us to move forward together as Americans, not as petty, opportunistic partisans. We can beat this, but only if we do it together.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
My home state of New York has become the epicenter of this terrible pandemic.
This bill brings financial support to increase the number of hospital beds, equip our brave doctors, nurses, EMTs, and other medical providers who are our front line of defense and who should not be asked to risk their lives to save others. This crisis will pass, our economy will recover, but American families and workers who lost their jobs by the millions to no fault of their own desperately need this financial support now. This bill provides important grants and loans to small businesses, which will be critical to our economic recovery. There's more for us to do, but this bill is an important first step to secure American families and workers.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was 5 or 6, I had a Sunday school teacher tell me a story that relates to a little bit what we're doing right now. A small child went missing in the Plains States. The community went 100 different directions. They didn't find the child. There was no results. They finally came together. They prayed to God, asked him for wisdom. They ended up holding hands and walking across the prairie. Mr. Speaker, they found that child. This country needs to remember that, and this body needs to remember that. I think we need to put our partisanship aside. We need to quit bickering. We need to ask Almighty God for wisdom and do what's right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You're doing a fine job.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the CARES Act. Over 2,500 Illinoisans have been diagnosed with the coronavirus, 26 of whom have died. Countless more are in need of testing, and thousands of our frontline healthcare workers are desperate for PPE. Just this month, over 130,000 Illinoisans have lost their jobs. This is unprecedented. The CARES Act provides immediate economic relief to individuals, billions in small business loans and grants, and improved unemployment protections. It will help states, local governments, and healthcare systems meet the enormous challenges that they are facing. And I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, please to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, head of the Pro-Life Caucus, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman is recognized.
As of today, Mr. Speaker, in my state alone, 6,800 people have been tested positive with 81 deaths, and in one family alone, 4 members of the family have died. Containing the pandemic, developing and deploying reliable therapeutics and a safe and effective vaccine must be our highest priority, no matter the cost. People, especially those on the front lines, in healthcare, first responders, are heroically meeting the challenge, often at great personal cost. The $2.2 trillion CARES Act is comprehensive and absolutely needed. It provides unprecedented support for taxpayers, small businesses, grants to hospitals, helps state and local governments, boosts unemployment, and food security. Special thanks to all of those on the House and Senate side, the leadership, for their cooperation in this bill, and to President Trump, the Vice President, Dr. Birx, and Dr. Fauci, and many others who have brought their expertise to confronting this huge challenge. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the CARES Act, and I'm so proud of the emergency housing priorities, including a temporary moratorium on evictions, foreclosures of homeowners, and federally backed mortgages. There's $4 billion for emergency grants for homelessness, $5 billion for CBDGs, and $1 billion for project-based rental assistance. We are in this fight together, and we will not be broken. Viruses come and go, but the courage of the American people
the gentleman has
endures.
expired.
God bless you all.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to the chairman of the Values Action Team, the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you. We're at war against an unseen enemy our world has never faced before. We are battling on 2 fronts, the healthcare front and the economic front. Thousands of people are sick, with courageous healthcare workers battling on the front lines. Meanwhile, millions of Americans have lost their jobs because of the virus, imperiling family budgets and devastating our economy. Today's bill sends needed battle reinforcements to both fronts. It provides funds to purchase more medical supplies and to support our hospitals, while also sending much-needed help to businesses so that they can make payroll and keep the doors open. It sends money directly to almost every household and supports those who have lost their job due to the COVID crisis. Most importantly, it gives this nation hope. Hope that we will get through this by supporting our healthcare workers, enabling businesses to stay open, and sending Americans funds needed to get them through. While this bill is far from perfect and the price tag is sobering, I believe we are in an unprecedented battle, and it is imperative we win this war. I will be voting yes, and I invite all Americans to join us in this battle.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland.
Excuse me. I yield 30 seconds. 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espelot.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the CARES Act. Mr. Speaker, it would be criminal not to support billions of dollars for our hospitals and healthcare workers. It will be criminal not to support billions of dollars for our small businesses that will struggle. It will be criminal not to support help for working families, $1,200 for individuals, $500 for child. But it is also criminal to leave out immigrants. They clean our houses, take care of our children and our elderly. It's also criminal to shortchange New York, which has become the epicenter of this epidemic. The delay of ventilators and PPEs has also been criminal. Remember, all of you, New York is your future.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would rather die than see my country stumble or fall. And by God, I mean that, and I don't think I'm the only one in this body that feels this way. And I have worried that as a result of a virus that was born in a disgusting market in Wuhan, China, that was hidden from the world, that our country may stumble. But I can tell you that that worry has subsided quickly for me as I looked around my own community and realized again that Americans are a salty group of tough SOBs that are defeated by absolutely nothing. And this isn't going to defeat us either. There's parts of this bill that I don't like, but I am proud that when Americans wake up tomorrow, they're going to continue to know that we wake up here not as victims, but as people with a greater opportunity than anybody across the world. 50 stars, 13 red and white stripes. We get to decide for ourselves if today is better than yesterday, this week is better than next week, this year, this month is better than last month, and next year, and so on. Nobody else gets to decide that for us. That hasn't changed, and it will never change. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Connor Lamb.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I know a firefighter who is going into sick people's homes still today with no mask. We all talk like this is war, but did George Marshall, a Western Pennsylvanian, wait for U.S. Steel to join the war effort in their own good time? No. He used to say, you cannot fight against the problem, you have to decide it. We have given this government money. We cannot give it leadership. Now is the time to decide this problem. Take this money, buy the masks, build the ventilators, protect our people now.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Ragabagan.
Gentlelady from American Samoa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in overwhelming support of this bipartisan legislation. The country needs it, and American Samoa desperately needs it. American Samoa has unique economic and geographic challenges. So far, my constituents are without any coronavirus testing at all, as NBC recently reported. The Army Corps has reported our LBJ hospital needs over $100 million in minimum improvements just to meet compliance standards. I want to thank the President for his leadership, and I thank my colleagues for including my request that the Pacific Territories and the freely associated states are in the definition of state, so all pandemic unemployment assistance programs apply to us. Our people are strong, and their faith is strong. Let's get this funding to work and provide testing in American Samoa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may God bless us all. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from New York, again, the epicenter, who knows this firsthand, Ms. Yvette Clarke.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I rise today in support of the CARES Act. My colleagues have spoken about the provisions of this bill, and although it is not perfect, it is a necessary one. We must now protect my constituents in the 9th District of New York, the epicenter, and all Americans across this country. New Yorkers have been through 9/11, the financial meltdown, Superstorm Sandy, and now we're in the midst of COVID-19. In my city, New York City, we're not just facing economic ruin, but also a genuine health crisis. That's why it's so critical that Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining on both sides?
The gentleman from Texas has 10½ minutes. The gentleman from Maryland has 11 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge strong support for the CARES Act. For years, my colleague and I from across the aisle, Anna Eshoo, have worked, and we worked to pass the Pandemic All-Hazardous Preparedness Act that was signed into law in June of 19. For years, we have said it was not a matter of if we would have a pandemic, but when we would have a pandemic. That when is now. And now is not the time to place blame. Now is not the time to look back. Now is the time to act and to look forward. Now is the time to restore confidence in this body. Now is the time to pass this act for those healthcare workers who are staying at the hospital while they're begging us to stay home. Now is the time for all those school children who are watching this body, thinking about and learning about this body, to show them that we can come together and govern. Now is the time to pass the CARES Act.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas
May God
reserves.
bless America.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to Mr. Sablon, who represents the Northern Marianas, and he does such an excellent job. Thank you very much. Yield 30 seconds.
Gentleman from the Northern Marianas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation we are considering to stop the coronavirus is not perfect. No legislation ever is, and we have more work to do. But even amid crisis, we should not forget to say thank you. For the third time, Speaker Pelosi has led this House to respond forcefully to the coronavirus, to give healthcare providers the resources, families financial aid, to support workers and businesses. And throughout this unprecedented time, always the Speaker and her leadership team remembered the United States of America includes the people of the Northern Mariana
Gentleman's
Islands.
time's expired.
And for that,
Gentleman from Maryland reserves.
Thank
Gentleman
you.
from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
New York is the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis today, and I want to thank our North Country heroes on the front lines, our nurses, our doctors, our hospital personnel, EMS, first responders, teachers, grocers, and truckers. The better angels of our nature are among us each and every day. Volunteers coming forward, quilting groups in the Adirondacks, students using 3D printers, mask making from Sackett's Harbor to Saratoga Flag. This emergency bill needed to pass yesterday. It needed to pass last week. New Yorkers and this nation need this relief immediately for our hospitals, healthcare heroes, and hardworking families. This country is a resilient nation. From the revolution to the Civil War to the pandemic flu to 9/11, we will overcome this. Congress needs to step up, do our job, pass this rescue package today for New York State and for the American people, and I yield back.
Back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it now gives me great honor to yield to the chairman of the Democratic caucus, the gentleman from New York, again the epicenter of this challenge that we have as a country, Hakeem Jeffries.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We also have assembled
the mightiest military. But you cannot judge the greatness of America based on our wealth or our military might. We should only judge the greatness of America based on how we stand up for the least, the lost, and the left behind. The CARES bill is legislation that will help and provide relief to the most vulnerable amongst us. It will provide relief to everyday Americans. It will provide relief to small businesses. It will provide relief to displaced workers. The coronavirus is a silent assassin and has targeted the American people. But we are a resilient nation. We defeated the Great Depression. We defeated Nazi Germany. We defeated Jim Crow. We will defeat COVID-19 as well.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I once again inquire as to the time?
The gentleman from Texas has 8.5 minutes. The gentleman from Maryland has 9.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bost.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the CARES Act. Even in rural southern Illinois, there are 27 cases in my district. Folks, we need to come together in a bipartisan manner with this bill to deal with, first, the health of our constituents. Second, the health of their pocketbooks in this bill. Third, those businesses where they need to go back to work, whether it's a small business or a large business. This bill does that. Is it perfect? No. But it is the right step forward that we need to do and do today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to our distinguished Vice Chair of our caucus, Catherine Clark from Massachusetts.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the CARES Act. Americans are facing a public health crisis that is an unprecedented threat to the health and safety of our communities. Hospitals are struggling to care for our communities and get the protective equipment they need. The pandemic has brought schools, businesses, and whole states to a standstill, including my home state of Massachusetts. Americans are calling for help, and today we will vote to bring them relief and offer them a lifeline, but it won't be the end of our support. To those on the front lines, healthcare workers, cashiers, child care providers, truck drivers, cleaners, and postal workers, and to all Americans, we say, we see you. We appreciate and are grateful for your sacrifice, and we will continue to fight for the people. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the citizens of the 1st District of Virginia to say that America's glass is still half full. While we face this unprecedented challenge, we see across our nation the resolve and the spirit of America. It is alive and well. While this is a challenge for us here in Congress to show the same spirit and resolve to get the job done for the American people. While this bill is far from perfect, it will demonstrate that we can come together and show what we have seen in the days past of what's going on across America. Folks, America's best days are still to come, and we continue to be the greatest nation the world has ever known. May God continue to bless our great United States of America.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, now I would like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from
30 seconds.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the American people want to know that their government will be there for them. They want to know that their tax dollars will pay dividends for them. They want to know that we will promote the general welfare as extolled in the preamble to the Constitution. They want to know that we will not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. This is not a perfect bill. It is a good bill. I will support it. The American people need certainty. They want to know that we will be there for them.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the good people of eastern Kansas. The war analogy has been thrown around a lot these days, and as a man who's been to war and spent many years there, I can tell you that's not altogether inaccurate. In both cases, people are frightened. In both cases, people die. And in both cases, people discover what it is they're made of. And when war, just like now, people need to come together. This bill is an example of having done just that. It's not perfect, but it's what we've got. It's got my vote. I'd urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Well, I think probably we're going to have to ring the bells.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would now like to yield to a senior member of the House and a cardinal from Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for 1 minute.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a proud Floridian, I rise to protect our workers, health professionals, small businesses, and veterans from this grave crisis we face. Senate Republicans drafted a corporate-friendly bill that failed to meaningfully support the millions who are losing their jobs. Instead, Democrats secured a package that invests $2 trillion in families, hospitals, and small businesses. Workers will get massive investments in unemployment benefits and an added 13 weeks of benefits, which Republicans fought to deny. Working-class families will get as much as $3,400 for a family of 4. Small businesses will get help to make payroll, rent, and utility costs. I'm proud that the Appropriations Committee spearheaded nearly $20 billion to ensure veterans' health needs are met, whether at the VA or local ERs and clinics. Appropriators have also worked to ensure our VAs can assist our local communities if they reach full capacity. This package is not perfect, and more help will be needed, but our families, small businesses, and hospitals need this help desperately. I ask my colleagues to give them this lifeline against this invisible enemy. We are all in this together. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We also reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield to the former president of the University of Wisconsin, president of the University of Miami, and secretary of Department of Health, one of our most knowledgeable members about issues of families and workers, the distinguished Secretary Donna Shalala, Congresswoman from Florida.
For how much time, please?
For 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Excuse me. 30 seconds. We have a lot of people going here.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, today we send the CARES Act to the President to provide the people in my community with the needed relief from the devastation of this pandemic. I'm here for the first responders, the healthcare workers, and all of those who are risking their lives. They are our heroes. Mr. Speaker, we need to support this bill now because we must. The virus has left us with no choice. But my hope is that after we have starved this virus, we will make a national commitment to permanently rebuild our public health infrastructure.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now another member of South Florida. All three of them have spoken now, indicating the importance of the crisis that confronts us. Debbie McCarcel-Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
How much time?
30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As of this morning, the U.S. has the most COVID-19 cases worldwide. Over 1,200 have tragically lost their lives. In Florida alone, we have over 2,300 cases, 652 in Miami-Dade County, 14 in Monroe County. South Florida is quickly becoming another epicenter of this pandemic. We are watching how numbers for unemployment are skyrocketing. Small businesses are closing. It's a tough reality to face, but we in Congress can do something. We can come together, set aside our ideological differences, and help people now. And that's why I support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Abby Finkenauer, for 30 seconds.
I'll give her time to prepare that podium there. Gentlelady from Iowa is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the great state of Iowa, where literally just moments ago, before I got up here to speak, I found out we lost another 2 Iowans to coronavirus, now up to 3, all in my congressional district. Today, we are grieving losses all over the country and the globe, where tragically necessary caution came too late. The package we're considering today is not perfect. It will not bring folks back that we lost, but it will give much needed relief to our hospital systems and workers on the front lines and to our working families and small businesses across the country.
Gentleman from
God
Maryland
bless the United
reserves.
States of America.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I have a time check?
From Maryland has 5½ minutes. 5½ minutes. Gentleman from Texas has 6½ minutes. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Gentleman from Texas, you have 6½ minutes left? Okay, I'll yield now 30 seconds to Colin Allred from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to speak to the people of North Texas, many of whom are under stay home, stay safe orders from smart leaders like Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins and Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson. I know many of you are frightened. I have heard from many of you who are worried about your family's health, your job, and your business. I want you to know that we are on your side. We are with you. We will not let this great country fail, and we will defeat this virus in a way that leaves no one behind. We should follow the examples of our brave first responders. Every American owes them a debt of gratitude, but we can best honor their service by staying home if you can and following the orders
Gentleman
that
from
we've been issued. I
Maryland
yield back.
reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, please to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Gentleman from Ohio has 1 minute.
I don't think anyone's happy about the present situation, but the free market did not close the economy. Governments chose that response to an exceptional risk to public health. The various governments made up in our country need to make sure that individuals, families, and businesses affected by their unprecedented decisions remain solvent and that as many people as possible remain employed. Like any war, the enemy votes too, but the sooner we can get lower-risk Americans back to work, the safer most people will feel. In our response, we must always defend our values and the way of life that makes America the world's land of opportunity. God bless you all.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to Mr. Chuy Garcia of Chicago.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the CARES Act, even though it doesn't protect everyone I wish it would, including all immigrants. However, it represents a bold, unprecedented step in protecting workers and bolstering our health care system and in stabilizing our economy, especially our small businesses. That's why I will vote aye. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Madeleine Dean, for 30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the leader. The coronavirus pandemic is a reminder of our common humanity and our interconnectedness. I stand today to say Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Berks County, Pennsylvania, my home district, have been particularly hard hit. There's suffering and courage in my community. We have had 3 deaths. I rise in support of this CARES Act. It is unprecedented. It's a monumental bill to send relief and confidence to those who are suffering, to our workers, to our families, to our children, to our business owners. I am proud to support this bill.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
You ready? You ready? Yes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the leader of the Republican conference, the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for the job you have done in the chair today. We thank you for the work that you are doing. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I want to say to everyone watching us at home right now, we hear your concern, we feel your anxiety, and we know what we need to do. When this year began, Americans were enjoying a level of peace and prosperity unheard of in modern times. The economy was at record highs. Unemployment for American workers was at record lows. Take-home pay was rising, and business closures were falling. And our brave men and women in uniform were protecting us from threats across the globe. But a few weeks ago, we learned about an invisible enemy from a distant land, an enemy like we've never faced before. Now the virus is here. We didn't invite it. We didn't ask for it.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House is not in order. Please, members, take your conversations to the hall. Wait. Gentlemen may proceed.
Now the virus is here. We did not invite it. We did not ask for it. We did not choose it. But we will fight it together until we win together. We will win because we have the best of our country on the front lines. We will win because of the other people in uniform, our doctors, our nurses, our lab technicians, and hospital volunteers. Take one moment and imagine, where would we be without their fortitude? They have the toughest jobs in the world, but they are truly the best in the world. You, our medical professionals, are our heroes. We, this entire body of members of Congress, salute you. We will always win because of our truck drivers, grocery store clerks, postal workers, farmers, and warehouse workers. You're working night and day. You're making a meaningful, measurable difference in the lives of everyone you serve. You are the foundation of everything we will do today. And we will win because of our scientists. Their bright minds and faster cures should give every American peace of mind. We are developing a victory vaccine faster than ever in the history of any virus. On behalf of all Americans and on behalf of all members of Congress, I want to thank those on the front lines for their professionalism and dedication. Another critical front in our war against this virus is the home front, literally. To slow the spread, the government is asking, and in some cases requiring, millions of small businesses and families to put their daily lives on pause and remain at home. I am overjoyed that so many have taken the imperative of social distancing so seriously. Flattening the curve is the most important activity any American citizen can do today. It is even more important now that the virus has arrived in full force. We are asking you to continue to remain at home as much as possible. I know this action carries substantial circumstances. We all saw that tragic news just this week. 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits. We have never experienced that before in our lives, not even in the Great Depression, that many. So what can we do for the hardworking taxpayers, their families, and small businesses, the pillars of the American life, who are doing their part but facing economic disaster through no fault of their own? First, we can recognize that their sacrifice are invaluable service to their fellow citizens. They deserve our eternal gratitude and prayers. Second, and more importantly, we can give them our financial support now, today, so they can weather this brutal storm in the weeks ahead. Which brings me to the rescue package before us today, the CARES Act. If developing tests and treatments and vaccines is America's new arsenal of democracy, the CARES Act is our modern-day all-American Marshall Plan. It is the largest assistance measure in American history, and it is going directly in the pockets of hardworking taxpayers, their families, and small businesses. For everyone affected by this virus, we will be your voice. For those battling the virus, or lost your job, or do not know if you'll have one a month or two from now, I want you to know we're listening, we hear you, and we are working for you. I want to give Leader McConnell a lot of credit. From the beginning, he was committed to a bottom-up, bipartisan, and bicameral process. He honored his commitment, and it shows. The Senate passed this bill by a unanimous vote. Every Republican, every Democrat. It is bold, truly bipartisan, and targeted to achieve the mission at hand. Our top priority is to keep Americans at work. So we aim the efforts to keep Americans employed through two measures. For small businesses and nonprofits, the bill provides 100% federally guaranteed loans for 8 weeks. If that loan is used to pay your employees, or pay your rent, or pay your utilities, it's no longer a loan, it's a grant, because we know what government has asked you to do. Other business gets a retention credit to keep employees on. If, unfortunately, American workers find themselves out of work, this bill offers an additional 13 weeks of unemployment insurance and dramatically expands eligibility. It also makes benefits more generous by adding another $600 across-the-board payment through the end of July. The CARES Act also expands unemployment insurance to cover gig workers and self-employed and nonprofit employees. Additionally, for American families that might need a little extra support, you will start receiving and seeing those checks in 3 weeks. You won't have to wait for months for financial help. Payments will be as much as $1,200 for an individual taxpayer and $500 per child. Finally, this legislation provides critical resources to American healthcare workers and hospitals. Over $140 billion in appropriations to support our health systems. We don't just talk about our respect for the medical heroes among us. We are going to give them the equipment to save lives and the tools they need to protect themselves. The reason for this legislation is to protect American workers, protect American jobs, and protect hard-working American taxpayers. We are providing targeted, temporary, and timely relief to Main Street, not Wall Street. We are not underwriting bad business practices or priming the pump. Ultimately, we are laying the foundation for a rapid economic recovery. This bill is not only a rescue package, it is a commitment. A commitment that your government and the people whom you elected to serve will do everything we can to limit the harm and hardship you face, both now and in the foreseeable future. To the American public, if you do your part, I promise we will do ours. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, it is our responsibility to act, to put aside our differences and do what's right for the American public. Aid must be robust, rapid, and resilient, just like its recipients. We are going to help Americans through this. We are going to do this together. And in the end, we are going to be healthier, stronger, and more united than ever before. Because, as Americans, that's who we are. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to Mr. Cohen from Tennessee.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Words above the Speaker's head at the top of this chamber are from Daniel Webster. He says, "May in our day and generation, may we not perform something worthy to be remembered. Today, as we have something worthy before us and something to be remembered, we should all vote aye. I am here to vote aye and to encourage the President to use the Defense Production Act for everyone and to continue talking to the President of China because this is a worldwide pandemic." I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now have the privilege of yielding to the Speaker of the House, who has been so critical in putting this piece of legislation together and focusing on workers and families. I yield to Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California.
The Speaker of the House is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the distinguished Democratic leader, Mr. Hoyer, for yielding and for the manner in which he has enabled so many of our members to participate in this debate today. Thank you, Mr. Hoyer, for your leadership on the legislation and also for leading us today. And I thank Mr. Brady for his leadership as well, for facilitating this conversation. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for keeping us reasonably on time as much as possible for congressional members. Thank you for the strength of your authority as Speaker of Pro Tem today. I thank all of our members for their participation on both sides of the aisle, for the seriousness which we have all taken this important challenge. Mr. Speaker, last week, His Holiness Pope Francis said in his world prayer, he said, "Enlighten those responsible for the common good so that they might know how to care for those entrusted to their responsibility." That is His Holiness's quote. And that is the responsibility that we all have. Today, as we have all acknowledged, our nation faces an economic and health emergency of historic proportions due to the coronavirus pandemic, the worst pandemic in over 100 years. As I proceed with my remarks, I want to say to our colleagues who are watching the proceedings from their chambers in the House to come forward and come to the gallery and listen from here, so that when the time comes, we will be prepared to proceed. The distinguished leader on the Republican side, Mr. McCarthy, and Mr. Hoyer have sent a communication to all of you to that effect. But it is very important that you come now. The sooner you come, the shorter my remarks will be. And I want to thank the distinguished leader on the Republican side for his leadership throughout all of this to achieve a bipartisan legislation and to do so as expeditiously as possible in the House, so that the message will be clear to the American people that whatever concerns we may have and whatever we want to do next, right now we're going to pass this legislation. And that is because so many American families have been touched by this crisis. More than 82,000 Americans so far have fallen sick, a number certain to surge as testing goes forward, and which is already the most in the world. We've gone past China and Italy. More than 1,200 Americans have tragically died. Gives you chills just to think of it. Millions of workers are losing their paychecks, including more than, as has been mentioned on both sides of the aisle, 3.2 million Americans who filed for unemployment last week alone, a staggering record-shattering figure. Countless healthcare workers, first responders, and others fighting on the front lines in this crisis are at great personal risk. The American people deserve a government-wide, visionary, evidence-based response to address these threats to their lives and their livelihood, and they need it now. Again, I acknowledge the bipartisanship on which we bring this legislation to the floor. Late Wednesday night, as the leader acknowledged, the Senate unanimously passed legislation which transformed, in our view, since you acknowledged Leader McConnell, I will acknowledge our distinguished chairman on our side, which they transformed a Republican corporate-focused bill into a Democratic workers-first focus. And we salute our chairs that working in a bipartisan way and in a bicameral way across the aisle and across the Capitol. We were able to dramatically expand unemployment insurance and defeated attempts on the Senate side to claw back the $600 per week added benefits that would provide essential relief to the record number of Americans losing their jobs. And I salute Chairman Richie Neal and Bobby Scott for the work that they did on this. I know this is the work of Ways and Means Committee, and successfully achieved full direct payments for workers. This is so important, ensuring that working class American families will be eligible to receive as much as $3,400 for a family of four. I thank again Mr. Neal and Madam Chair of the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters, who both of them had bigger proposals, but nonetheless advocating for all of this. And by the way, I would suggest, and instead of saying it's going to take a few weeks for the checks to get there, that the administration electronically transfer those direct payments immediately. We ensured in the bill that any taxpayer dollars given to industry goes first and foremost to workers. Workers' paychecks and benefits not used to pay CEO bonuses, stock fund buybacks, or dividends, and the rest. And I thank, and we have secured robust special oversight that will hold the administration accountable for this. And I thank the distinguished chair of the, where'd he go, Energy, the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee, Mr. DeFazio, for his leadership in that regard. I will not try to find all of you because you may be in the gallery as we are encouraging members to come. Here we go. And we're also proud, again, I want to salute Congresswoman Waters for the work for the having the oversight provisions in the bill for the account that is going to be spending money out. We're also proud to have secured a truly historic investment of hundreds of billions of dollars in hospitals, health systems, state and local governments, ensuring that they have the tools they need to combat the virus. I salute Chairman Pallone, Chairwoman Lowy of the Appropriations Committee, and Chairwoman DeLauro for making so much of all of that possible. And when we talk about state and local government, I want to express pride in our own Governor, Gavin Newsom. He was on the front line of attacking this, as well as my own Mayor Breed, who has disciplined us to shelter in place. For small businesses, thank you, Congresswoman, Madam Chair Velasquez, and working in a bipartisan way, we want fast relief for those in need, including by securing $10 billion for SBA emergency grants of up to $10,000 and making payroll costs, rent, mortgage interest, and utility costs eligible for SBA loan forgiveness. And for the first time, we have grants from the SBA. And thanks to Secretary Mnuchin, he is facilitating this by not just all of the loans going through the SBA, but going through banks with the SBA imprimatur, which makes this all go much faster. For our students, we paused payments for federal student loan borrowers, paused the payments, and suspended wage garnishment and negative credit reporting during this time. For that and for so many other things relating to our students, I thank Bobby Scott, our chairman of Education and Workforce and Labor. And for our veterans, you heard earlier all of these chairmen make these presentations. For our veterans, we secured nearly $20 billion in funding to improve VA's readiness with equipment, tests, and additional care as again, 571 veterans and 85 employees have now tested positive, and I thank Chairman Takano and others on the committee for their leadership. For our homeowners, renters, and homeless creditors, again, I thank, and consumers, I thank Chairwoman Waters for her leadership there. Since the beginning of this crisis, we have fought to ensure that our nation's response puts families first as we go through this. So the first two bills that we worked in a bipartisan way on were about addressing the emergency. The first bill was about testing to ensure that everyone in the country would have access to free testing. Among other things, it had in there issues that relate to research for a vaccine, research for a cure, but many other things addressing the emergency. In the second bill, which also focused on the emergency, we have mask, and many other provisions focused on the emergency, but taking us to this bill today, which is about mitigation. As our distinguished Mr. DeFazio would say, first we had emergency, then we have mitigation. Doesn't mean we're finished with emergency, but it's moving on to mitigating for some of the economic and health damage caused by this pandemic. Next, we will move to recovery, and hopefully that will be soon. Always, though, addressing the emergency and the mitigation needed. How are we coming, Mr. Leaders? How are we coming with our, our gallery? As we have all said universally, and we say it almost all the time that we come to the floor, no bill is perfect. No bill is perfect. But we want to make sure that at least comes near part of the way to being sufficient. I do think that we should, when we're considering a bill, appreciate for what is in the bill rather than judge it for what is not in the bill. But we do know that we must do more. There's been a constant communication among all of our members, I'm sure on both sides of the aisle, when you're at home or here, with doctors, healthcare providers, laborers, small businesses, nonprofits, faith groups, and scientists on the daily needs and developments in your communities. The on-the-ground reports and clear-eyed thinking we have are essential to crafting our approach to all of this. So again, listening to members on both sides of the aisle and your comments here today, as well as the input that you have been giving in the legislative process, we know that this cannot be our final bill. Yet this bill, again, is I think Bobby Scott called it a down payment. We must advance a fourth bill to address the continued needs. For our fight against the coronavirus, our state and local governments will need vastly more support for preventing, preparing for, and responding to the crisis. Our hospitals and health systems still need vast infusions of funding so they can treat those in need. We must do more. For our healthcare workers, and this has been a current theme on both sides of the aisle, our gratitude for our healthcare workers. They are our heroes. We're thankful and grateful to them. We pray for them. But we need to do more for them than just to say those words. Our frontline healthcare workers, and whether emergency needs, our firefighters, our law enforcement, face a dire lack of medical and personal protective equipment. PPE, personal protective equipment. That's the reference that when you see PPE, that's what it is. We must ensure that the President uses the Defense Production Act to its full extent to provide the tools that we need to combat this crisis. All workers are risking their lives on the front lines of this fight and need stronger OSHA protections to keep them safe. Thank you, Mr. Scott. This week, for example, and you probably all have examples. This week, we learned of the tragic death of Caius Kelly, a nurse manager in New York who died in the line of duty from coronavirus. He and his fellow nurses risked their lives without proper protective equipment because the hospital supply simply did not have enough. Nurses were given a single plastic protective gown to use for an entire shift, when protocol called for a change of gowns between interactions with patients. Other nurses were forced to resort to tying bandanas over their faces in place of proper equipment. And still others even began tying plastic garbage bags around disposable scrubs that they were given in place of proper scrubs for extra protection. As Mr. Kelly's sister said, his death could have been prevented. I'm angry. He was healthy. And now our nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, and first responders need action. We have to make sure they know that help is not only on the way, but it is a priority for all of us. These people risk their lives trying to save other people's lives, and then they take home what they interacted with in an infected environment, take home. This is just asking far too much. Our families, our workers, our retirees still need more money in their pockets to protect their income security. with increased SNAP. One thing we couldn't get in the bill was the 15% increase in food stamps for our children, for our seniors, for those who qualify. Bigger direct payments. I hope that we'll be in agreement. I know that Richie and Maxine had the idea of ongoing direct payments, so bigger direct payments. Pension protections. We had a protection in the legislation. It was supported by everyone. The President of the United States supported it, but Senator McConnell said he would save it for the next bill. So that's why I'm mentioning it, for the next bill. And then we need more expanded family and medical leave. Let me give you an example. Come on, my colleagues, to the gallery. Let me give you an example. If your parent is sick but had ongoing caregiver in the home or went to a senior health center on a daily basis, and because of the virus, that caregiver couldn't come or that health center was closed, you would be able to take family and medical leave. However, as in the case of many members here, if your mom or your dad are healthy and they contract the coronavirus, you would not be able to take family and medical leave. What we would like that to say is for those who cannot care for themselves, it just doesn't make any sense in my view. So in any case, we need that, and without exception. And all Americans need free coronavirus treatment so they don't have to fear the high cost of a hospital stay and others. When we said that the tests were free, it didn't mean that the test is free, but your visit to the doctor is not. And so in the days and weeks to come, Democrats will continue to advance legislation to meet the urgent needs of all affected by the coronavirus. And I keep saying the coronavirus because in this bill, people say, well, how come we didn't do this or that? Because this is specific to the coronavirus challenge that we have. I just want to say a word about our children as I close. So many of our children, I want them, if they're paying attention, distinguished Congresswoman Brooks mentioned the children. We're so sad for them that they cannot be fully engaged in school as they were. Some have access to remote learning and the rest. And this has had a deep impact on American life as it affects our children as well. When I see that some graduations have been canceled, and hopefully not so many more if we can get through this. And I've been, as a mother of 5, grandmother of 9, personally, but officially in my leadership role, I have seen hundreds of thousands of graduates. And what's exciting about it personally and officially is to see the excitement of the families when their child graduates. But when that family happens to have someone on the stage who is the first in the family to graduate, the pride, the joy, the patriotism, all of it is so exuberant, and many of them will be deprived of that experience of seeing that child walk across the stage. So let's try to get this. We had the best minds working 24/7, all hands on deck to find a cure. Let's make sure that we give them the resources they need to do so, but at the same time that we obey the science that says shelter in place or whatever it happens to be. So as we go forward, let us pray. Let us remember what His Holiness told us. What he told us was that we have a responsibility for the common good. So let us prepare for all the loved ones who have lost family members and others who are struggling with the illness now. Let's pray for our heroic healthcare workers and first responders who are risking their lives to care for the sick every day, the men and women in our factories making more medical supplies and personal protective equipment, the farmers, producers, and grocery workers keeping food on the shelves, our truck drivers, postal workers, everybody who is contributing to the effort, and the scientists, as I say, all hands on deck 24/7 for a solution. Congress must show the same courage, same resilience, same strength, and with a great unity and urgency to put families and workers first. Let me again thank everyone who had any thing to do with this, and that means almost everybody in this room. Let me thank the Senate Democrats and Leader Schumer for his work, as you acknowledge Leader McConnell. And let us again return to the words of His Holiness Pope Francis. May we enlighten those responsible for the common good so that they may know now to care for those entrusted to their responsibility. With that, I hope we have the biggest possible vote for the American people to show them that Congress's heart and the country's heart is full of love for the American people. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no other speakers and prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Thank you,
Gentleman
Leader McCarthy, for your strong and relentless leadership. Thank you for allowing each of us to bring to the table the pro-growth policies that brought about the strongest economy on the planet as we headed into this challenge. Thank to our House leaders, to our ranking members and all the key committees, Representative Grangers and Fox, Representatives Walden, McHenry, Cole, and Shabbat, to each of the members here today who have engaged in this historic agreement, and to the professional teams who have backed us every moment, night and day, in this endeavor. I want to thank our Democratic colleagues for working with us on this bipartisan bill, to our Republican colleagues in the Senate. I especially want to thank Secretary Mnuchin, the point man for President Trump on these negotiations, as well as all of the cabinet, the White House economic team. And I especially want to thank President Trump for his strong and results-oriented leadership at a time of unprecedented crisis for this great country. In times of challenge, I lean on this proverb: fear knocked, faith answered, no one was there. Coronavirus has knocked at America's door, and with it, fear. Faith is answering. We answer with faith in ourselves and our abilities, faith in our free enterprise system, faith in our amazing healthcare system, and yes, faith that when the chips are down, Congress can come together with our president to help hardworking families and businesses when they need it most. We answer that door at this crucial moment with faith in our Creator and faith in our great American spirit. This is the challenge of a lifetime. But if we keep pulling together, if we pass this bill today without delay, we take another step toward that day when we answer the door and fear is no longer there. On behalf of President Trump and the Republican Congress, we urge support for this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as has been said so many times on this floor, America has faced many threats, some in the nature of attack by enemies, some in the nature of natural disasters, whether they be hurricanes or tornadoes or floods. And Americans have responded and overcome those threats. We now have a threat, as some have mentioned, that is unseen, but has a great effect, and is having a great effect today as we debate this bill in America. And today we will vote not as Democrats or Republicans, but we will vote as Americans who have been sent here to represent our country and our people, to promote the general welfare. Certainly the general welfare has been put at risk by this virus. We have, in a very short time, passed 3 major pieces of legislation 2 that generated in this House, 1 generated in the Senate. And we will pass this bill today. I want to thank the majority leader. Excuse me, the minority leader. I'm the majority leader, right? You can't have it. And while we enjoy a little levity, we understand the gravity of this situation. People will die today as a result of this virus. And we have come together as Democrats and Republicans from every region of this country to respond in a way sufficient for the challenge. And we know we'll need to do more. But this day, let us hope that, like the United States Senate, we come together, each and every one of us, not for partisan advantage, but for the advantage and defense of our people. America has been blessed by God and by our people. Let us respond this hour to their need in their defense so that America will go forward stronger and better and more ready to face future challenges. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 911, the previous question is ordered on the motion. The question is on adoption of the motion. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purposes, gentlemen, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I came here to make sure our republic doesn't die by unanimous consent in an empty chamber, and I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise and remain standing until counted. An insufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is refused.
Mr. Speaker.
Is the gentleman recognized?
I object on the basis that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
The chair will count for a quorum. Counted for a quorum is present. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Section 7B of House Resolution 891, the House stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on Tuesday, March 31st, 2020.